Depending on who you ask, this is either a masterpiece of mid-20th century design or the ugliest building in Hampshire. Designed to mimic the grand scale of the ocean liners in the port below, this massive stack of concrete has spent over half a century dividing opinion. It's bold, it's brutal, and it's a listed building. This is Wyndham Court. Hello and welcome to Lutopia. My name's Lewis and this time I'm in the port city of Southampton looking at a building that still exists. But not everyone is happy that it still exists. So, you will find Wyndham Court on the northern side of Southampton Central Station. If you happen to exit on the southern side, you'll miss it and instead be treated to a lovely Art Deco travel interchange. But today we're on the other side. Things are different here. When you first emerge into the bright southern sunshine, you're greeted with a selection of architecture mostly built in the 1960s and 70s. And while there have been efforts to modernise and soften the space with murals and cladding and this shared pavement road thing where you're probably going to get run over, Wyndham Court remains just as it always has been. Over there. But why is it there? During the Second World War, Southampton was a major target. It had a large port, it had factories churning out Spitfires, and being on the south coast of England, it was just a short hop across the channel from Germany's airfields in France. So it didn't really stand a chance, and in the end, over 2,000 bombs fell on the town, destroying or damaging 45,000 buildings, including 1 out of every 8 homes. Just take a look at this 1934 map showing the area where Wyndham Court stands today. You can see the outlines of streets, which are pretty crammed full of buildings, and excitingly, there are no less than 7 pubs. But by the end of the war, in 1945, it looked like this. Not much left. And it largely stayed that way until the 1960s. By then, the country was in the grip of a massive housing crisis. It wasn't just that the population was booming, it was that the homes people already lived in were falling apart. Thousands of families were still crammed into Victorian terraces, which often lacked basic things like indoor toilets and hot water. So, far from being the charming period properties that command a premium today, back then they were seen as slums, and they had to go. Luckily, around the same time, the era of post-war austerity was finally fading, and there was a little bit of cash to spend. There was new technology too, meaning that the efficient, high-density housing that was so desperately needed could now be built. One of the key new technological processes was prefabrication, aka prefab. This moved a lot of the construction of a building from the rainy outdoors into a controlled factory environment, where large components like walls, floors, or even entire rooms could be made in advance, shipped to the site, and put together like a giant 3D jigsaw. So, when Southampton was granted official city status in 1964, its brutal transition from industrial town into modern city could really get going. This was very much a time of out with the old and in with the new, so with that in mind, a large area outside the station was cleared for construction in 1965. Such was the size of the plot that 2 streets vanished completely from the map, Blechynden Street and Hill Street. And sadly, the demolition site also included a stretch of commercial road, which brought an abrupt end to this row of shops. But you know, progress. Things were also changing over at the station because it was in the process of being renamed Southampton, having started life as Southampton West and changing to Southampton Central, which it would revert back to in the 1990s. It was also being rebuilt, with its old Victorian entrance and clock tower making way for this beautiful new office block. You know, I can see why so many people say that in the years following the war, the city planners did almost as much damage as the Luftwaffe. The architects chosen to design Wyndham Court were Lyons Israel Ellis, a London-based firm known for their grey public sector buildings. With Wyndham Court, they wanted to make a bold statement, and they were given the freedom to do so by the council, who considered this to be a sensitive site. This was because it was just down the road from Southampton Civic Centre, which is a large municipal building built around a century ago to provide a new home for the council offices, law courts, police station, art gallery and guild hall, all under one roof, or many roofs. So, although Wyndham Court was intended to be ultra-modern, it still had to be sympathetic to its neighbour up the road. Because of this, white concrete was chosen for the exterior, the idea being that this would mimic the Portland stone cladding of the Civic Centre, when it's clean, which is never. Inside Wyndham Court would be 184 apartments, some of them one-bedroom flats and bedsits, but mostly 2- or 3-bedroom maisonettes. These are duplexes, so split across 2 floors, usually with the kitchen and living area on the lower level and the bedrooms above. Residents enter their homes via wide open-air walkways or access decks, which, along with the balconies, break up the outside and create a bit of variety. At street level, there are retail units, which are still popular today. Now, the apartments here weren't going to be just any old social housing. They were going to be prestige or luxury homes for professional tenants and would be leased at above-average rents. Because of this, they would need to be spacious, with plenty of natural light, large private balconies, and they'd have underfloor heating, which was super futuristic at the time. Of course, it almost goes without saying that the building is a prime example of the architectural style known as Brutalism. Highly popular between the 1950s and 70s, this movement was defined by bold geometric forms and constructed in raw concrete, which is where it gets its name from. Béton brut means raw concrete in French. It's nothing to do with being brutal at all. One of the interesting things about Wyndham Court is that if you look closely at the concrete, you'll notice that it has what's known as a board-marked finish. This is where the raw concrete, or béton brut, is poured into a mould made of wooden planks. So when it sets, the grain of the wood stays imprinted on the outside. It's an interesting attempt at making what is a massively man-made material seem more natural, more rugged, more nautical. Other effects used to make the building look like a giant boat include the way the lift motor rooms are intentionally prominent on the top of the building, like funnels. And because much of the building is raised on stilts like columns, the huge, heavy structure feels lighter, like it's hovering or floating, like a ship. Because the site sits on a hill, the building varies between 6 and 7 stories, and the underground car park actually reuses the basements of the Victorian buildings that used to stand here. Handy. And on top of the car park, in the centre of the building, is a courtyard garden area. This was supposed to be a quiet sanctuary away from the hustle and bustle of the neighbouring railway station, and was supposed to have greenery and cascading water features, but it seems to have been largely abandoned. This is a bit of a shame, as schemes like the Barbican in London, built around the same time, make pretty good use of trees, plants and ponds against all that concrete. But all is not lost, as just across the road is Blechynden Terrace Garden. This garden's been created in what remains of the Empiria building, which was a large warehouse constructed here in the late 19th century. It was destroyed in an air raid in 1940, and today it's one of the last remaining bomb sites in Southampton, unless you count Jester's nightclub. In 2018, the garden was redesigned with a steel moongate arch framing the central walkway. There's also a laser-cut steel screen showing how, if you'd peered out of this building in 1910, you would have seen the shoreline. Maybe I'll do a video about that. And so, having won an Architectural Design Award no less, Wyndham Court was eventually completed in 1969. It gets its name from Wyndham Place, which is opposite, and is itself named after a Mrs. Wyndham, who in the 19th century lived in a grand residence nearby called Hamilton House. We don't know a lot about Mrs. Wyndham and why she inspired the naming of the road and this building, but I'm sure she'd be delighted. So that concludes the story of Wyndham Court. Many people in this city are ashamed of it. Ashamed that the first thing millions of people see when they get off their train is this. To them, it's an eyesore. It's grey, the concrete is stained, it's expensive to maintain, and the whole Brutalist thing is a symbol of a failed social experiment. And yet despite all that, Wyndham Court was granted Grade 2 listed status by Historic England in 1998, so it can't ever really be knocked down. Why? Well, what we have here is thought by many to be a heroic piece of civic architecture. It might be a 60s block of flats, but unlike most of them, it's not just a boring box. This one features a brave, dramatic look thanks to its complex step structure, recessed windows, geometric balconies, and the intricate tactile grain of that board-marked concrete. Also, despite all the criticism, this place is by all accounts an alright place to live. Unlike many housing projects of its era, it's pretty safe, it's extremely well located, and the flats are a good spec. They were designed to be prestige, after all. So what do you think? Is Wyndham Court a triumph that should be celebrated, or an embarrassment that should have been demolished decades ago? Do please let me know in the comments. Thank you ever so much for watching. See you next time.